The German shepherd froze at the edge of the cliff, and what he was staring at made the veteran forget the home he had just lost. A chunk of the trail exploded beneath Ethan's boots. Rocks thundered into the ocean below as Boone slammed into his legs, knocking him backward. Rain stung his face. The dog stood over him, growling toward a narrow opening hidden in the red cliffs. Ethan could hear waves crashing inside the darkness, but something else was down there. Something his grandmother had spent decades trying to protect. What do you think was hidden inside that cliff? The sound that got Ethan Calloway was not the lawyer's voice. It was the sharp crack of a folder hitting the conference table. For a fraction of a second, his shoulders tightened. His eyes flicked toward the door, then the windows, then the hallway beyond the glass wall, 3 exits, 1 blind corner, no immediate threat. His breathing settled. Nobody in the room seemed to notice. Nobody except Boone. The German shepherd, lying beside Ethan's chair, lifted his head slightly, watching him with calm amber eyes before resting his chin back on his paws. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Ethan, I'd like to walk you through these documents." "Walk you through." The phrase sounded polite, almost respectful. The papers spread across the polished table said something different. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the office building overlooking the Columbia River. The sky outside was gray enough to erase the horizon. Ethan sat at the head of the table where he had sat for nearly 20 years. The chair no longer felt like his. Across from him sat his son, Ryan Calloway, 40 years old, expensive watch, expensive jacket. The same blue eyes Ethan saw every morning in his own mirror. Beside Ryan sat Ashley, his wife. She stared at her folded hands. She hadn't looked Ethan in the eye once since the meeting began. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "The acquisition finalized 3 weeks ago." Ethan stared. "The acquisition?" Ryan finally spoke. "The company was sold, Dad." The room went quiet. Even the rain seemed to fade. Sold. The word drifted through the air. The company Ethan had spent 30 years helping build after returning from Iraq. The company where he'd worked weekends, holidays, double shifts. The company whose loading docks still carried dents he remembered making himself during the early years. Sold. "When?" Ethan asked. Ryan looked uncomfortable. "Last month." Ethan nodded once, not because he understood, because he needed a second. Boone slowly stood and moved closer to his chair. The lawyer continued. "The transfer was entirely legal. As majority shareholder, Mr. Ryan Calloway was authorized to proceed." "Mr. Ryan Calloway, not your son, not Ryan. Mr. Ryan Calloway." Ethan looked down at the papers. His own signature appeared several times. Documents signed over the past 2 years. Documents Ryan had brought to him after his wife's death. Small things, routine things, or so he'd believed. His thumb rubbed the edge of the table. The wood felt smooth, too smooth, like nothing in the room was real. The lawyer slid another paper forward. "The residence has also been transferred into a family trust." Ethan looked up. "My house?" Ryan shifted in his seat. "Our house." The correction landed harder than a punch. For 3 years after Sarah died, Ethan had tried to keep the family together. Christmas dinners, Sunday cookouts, birthdays, every tradition Sarah had loved. He'd handed Ryan more responsibility each year, because that was what fathers did, because he trusted him, because he thought family meant something. "The trust gives us flexibility moving forward," Ryan said carefully. "Use." Another word, another knife. Ethan looked at Ashley. She lowered her eyes, still silent. The lawyer kept talking. Accounts, transfers, ownership structures, percentages, tax advantages. The words blurred together. Somewhere beyond the rain and glass, a truck backfired on the street below. Ethan's head snapped toward the window before he could stop himself. His heart kicked once. A flash, dust, heat. A convoy rode outside Mosul. The smell of burning rubber, a radio screaming contact reports. Then it was gone. Back to the office, back to Oregon, back to the lawyer. Boone had moved closer. One paw rested against Ethan's boot, grounding him, keeping him here. The lawyer finally stopped speaking. The silence felt enormous. Ethan looked at his son. "How long?" Ryan frowned. "What? How long have you been planning this?" Ashley closed her eyes. Ryan leaned back. The answer took too long. "About a year, a year." Ethan nodded slowly. "A year of family dinners, a year of smiles, a year of shaking hands, a year of waiting." The rain intensified against the windows. Nobody spoke. Then Ryan reached into his briefcase and slid one final document across the table. "The good news is you still have the coastal property." Ethan stared at him. "The cabin? Yeah." Ryan laughed softly. Actually laughed. The sound echoed in the room. "At least Grandma's old beach shack is still yours." Nobody else laughed. Not Ashley. Not the lawyer. Not even Ryan after the sound left his mouth. The shame arrived too late. Ethan looked at the document. Margaret Calloway's cabin. A forgotten piece of land on the Oregon coast. He hadn't seen it in almost 20 years. His grandmother had left it to him after her death. Sarah always wanted to restore it someday. They never did. Life got busy. Work happened. Years disappeared. Now it was all he had left. The lawyer spoke carefully. "You'll have 7 days to vacate the residence. 7 days. 35 years building a life. 7 days to leave it." Ethan pushed back his chair. The movement startled everyone. Boone rose instantly. The old military dog moving with silent precision despite his age. Ryan stood. "Dad." "No." The single word stopped him. Ethan gathered nothing. Not the papers, not the folders, nothing. He looked around the room one last time. The conference table, the framed company awards, the river beyond the windows, the son he'd spent a lifetime trying to protect. Then he turned toward the door. "Dad, please," Ryan said. Ethan stopped. For a moment Ryan looked 12 years old again. The boy who used to wait at the window for his father to come home. The boy who once wore Ethan's oversized army jacket around the house. Gone. Just another stranger in an expensive suit. Ethan's voice was quiet. "When your mother died, I thought losing her would be the hardest thing that ever happened to me." Ryan lowered his eyes. Ethan nodded once. "I was wrong." Then he walked out. Boone followed beside him. Not ahead, not behind, beside. The way he always had. The elevator ride down felt longer than the entire meeting. The lobby doors opened. Cold rain greeted them. Ethan stood under the awning for a long moment. Cars moved through wet streets. People hurried past. Nobody knew his world had ended 30 minutes earlier. Nobody cared. Boone sat beside him, rain mist collecting on his black and tan fur. Ethan looked down. The dog looked back, steady, patient, present. The way only dogs could be. For the first time all day, Ethan placed a hand on Boone's neck. The shepherd leaned into it, just enough, not asking for comfort, offering it. Across town sat a house that no longer belonged to him. Ahead of him waited a cabin forgotten by almost everyone. And somewhere beyond the storm, on a lonely stretch of Oregon coastline, something his grandmother had left behind was still waiting. Neither Ethan nor Boone knew it yet, but the life that had just been taken from him was not the story. It was only the beginning. The first thing Ethan packed was Boone's food bowl. Not because it was valuable, not because it was expensive, because it was still where Sarah had left it. The stainless steel bowl sat on a rubber mat beside the laundry room door. A small scratch ran across one side where Boone had knocked it against the wall years ago, while chasing a tennis ball through the house. Ethan stared at it for a moment before picking it up. The house was quiet, too quiet. 7 days sounded generous when a lawyer said it across a conference table. 7 days disappeared quickly when every room held a memory. By the third morning, most of the furniture was gone. The family photographs had been boxed. The garage shelves stood empty. Only a few things remained: his clothes, his old army footlocker, a framed photograph of Sarah standing on Cannon Beach 20 years earlier, with the Pacific Ocean behind her, and Boone, always Boone. The German Shepherd followed him from room to room, never more than a few feet away. When Ethan carried a box to the truck, Boone carried a worn rope toy. When Ethan returned for another load, Boone was waiting by the door. No questions, no complaints, just loyalty, the kind that asked for nothing in return. On the morning he left, rain hung low over Portland. The sky looked like wet concrete. Ethan loaded the last box into his aging Ford F-150. The truck had nearly 300,000 miles on it. The driver's seat was cracked. The heater worked only when it felt like it. The paint had faded years ago, but it was paid for. That made it more valuable than most things these days. Boone jumped into the passenger seat without being told. He turned twice, settled into position, and looked toward the house. Ethan followed his gaze. The curtains moved slightly in an upstairs window. Someone was watching Ryan. Or Ashley, maybe both. Neither came outside. Neither said goodbye. Ethan climbed behind the wheel, started the engine. The truck shuddered awake. For a moment he sat there with his hands resting on the steering wheel. 35 years. Gone. Then he shifted into gear and drove away. No dramatic farewell, no final speech. The house disappeared in his rearview mirror. Nobody called. Not that day, not the next, not the day after. The silence became its own companion. The drive west toward the Oregon coast stretched across miles of rain-dark highways and evergreen forests. The farther he drove, the fewer buildings he saw, the fewer people, which suited him just fine. By the second evening, fatigue had settled deep into his bones. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since Sarah died. Some nights were worse. Some nights he woke convinced he heard voices, or engines, or radio traffic. The doctors called it hypervigilance. The army had called it staying alive. Near midnight, somewhere along Highway 26, headlights suddenly appeared over a hill. Bright, white, blinding. For a split second, the lights merged with another memory. A convoy outside Mosul. Dust hanging in the air. Night vision turning everything green. A radio operator shouting coordinates. A vehicle burning on the shoulder. Ethan's grip tightened. The truck drifted toward the center line. A horn blasted. Reality slammed back. Boone was already moving. One large paw landed firmly on Ethan's forearm. Not hard, just enough. Ethan blinked. The oncoming truck passed. Rain sprayed across the windshield. The convoy vanished. The highway returned. His breathing slowed. "Easy, boy," he whispered. Boone kept his paw there another few seconds before pulling it back, as if making sure Ethan was really present, as if making sure he came all the way home. They stopped at a roadside diner shortly after midnight. The parking lot was nearly empty. A neon open sign buzzed in the window. Ethan ordered coffee. Boone got half a hamburger. The waitress brought a bowl of water without asking. She smiled at Boone. "Beautiful dog." Ethan nodded. He earned every gray hair. The waitress laughed softly. Boone accepted the compliment with complete indifference. When they returned to the road, the rain had stopped. The clouds slowly broke apart. Moonlight touched the tops of the trees. Around dawn, Ethan rolled down the window. Cold air rushed inside, and then he smelled it. Salt, faint at first, then stronger, the Pacific Ocean. He hadn't been here in years. Beside him, Boone lifted his head. His ears perked forward. He smelled it too. The highway narrowed. The forests thickened. Road signs became less frequent. Gas stations disappeared. Civilization slowly retreated. Finally, near sunset, Ethan turned onto a gravel road so narrow that tree branches scraped both sides of the truck. The GPS lost signal almost immediately. The road climbed, curved, then climbed again. At the top of a ridge, the ocean suddenly appeared. A vast sheet of steel gray water stretching to the horizon. Waves crashed against black cliffs hundreds of feet below. The sight stole the breath from his lungs, not because it was beautiful, because it was familiar. Sarah had loved this place. She used to talk about retiring here, fixing up Margaret's cabin, growing old by the sea. The thought hit harder than he expected. He swallowed and kept driving. Another mile, then another, until the road ended. The cabin stood alone on a windswept bluff overlooking the Pacific. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Boone moved. The place looked worse than any memory he carried. Far worse. Half the shingles were missing. The porch sagged badly to one side. One window was boarded shut. Another had been shattered and patched with weathered plywood. Tall grass surrounded the structure like a forgotten grave. The sea wind howled through gaps in the siding. Boone slowly stood, his nose pressed against the passenger window. Ethan stared at the cabin, then at the ocean beyond it, then back at the cabin. Everything he owned now fit inside one truck, and this broken building. The wind rattled something loose on the roof. A sharp, metallic clang echoed through the evening. Boone's ears twitched. Neither of them looked away, because despite its condition, despite the years, despite everything, this was home now, or at least the only place left that still had Ethan Calloway's name on it. The ocean wind hit harder after sunset. It came off the Pacific in long, cold gusts that rattled the loose shingles and pushed against the cabin walls like an impatient visitor. Ethan stepped out of the truck and stood for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. Not true silence. The crash of waves far below, the groan of weathered wood, the distant cry of gulls drifting somewhere beyond the cliffs. Boone jumped down from the passenger side and landed heavily on the damp ground. For a second, Ethan expected the dog to follow him toward the porch. Instead, Boone stopped. The shepherd's ears lifted. His body went completely still. He was staring beyond the cabin, toward the dark ridge behind it, toward the bluff. "Easier, buddy," Ethan muttered. Boone didn't move. The dog sniffed the air once, twice, then slowly walked several yards away and stood facing the cliff line, watching, listening. The behavior tugged at something familiar in Ethan's memory. Years ago, in Iraq, he'd learned to pay attention when working dogs became interested in something. They noticed things humans missed: changes, movement, danger, or secrets. The thought came and went. He was tired. Too tired. The cabin demanded attention first. The front steps sagged beneath his boots. The porch leaned noticeably toward the ocean. The front door looked as if it hadn't opened properly in years. When Ethan tried the handle, it refused to move. He tried again. Nothing. "Perfect," he muttered. A truck engine rumbled somewhere behind him. Ethan turned immediately. Old habits always identify the sound. A faded green pickup emerged from the trees and rolled to a stop near the gate. The driver climbed out slowly. White beard, worn flannel jacket, weathered face, the kind of face shaped by decades of salt air. The man studied Ethan for several seconds. Then Boone, then the cabin. "You Margaret's grandson?" Ethan nodded. The old man spit into the grass. "Thought so." He walked forward and extended a hand. "Hank Rollins." Ethan shook it. The grip was firm, working man strong. "Neighbor?" Hank laughed. "Closest one you've got. 5 miles that way." He pointed down the coastline. His eyes drifted toward the cabin. "Place looks worse every year. Not exactly encouraging. Wasn't meant to be." A smile appeared beneath the beard. Small, but genuine. For the first time since leaving Portland, Ethan almost smiled back. Hank disappeared to his truck and returned carrying a crowbar. "Door swells every winter," he said. "Your grandmother used to keep one hanging beside the porch." Together they worked the door loose. The wood groaned. The frame protested, then the seal finally broke. A breath of cold, stale air drifted out. The smell stopped Ethan in his tracks. Old cedar, dust, salt, and something else. A faint trace of lamp oil, as though time itself had been trapped inside. The interior sat frozen in another decade. Furniture draped beneath faded sheets, a stone fireplace, bookshelves, a small kitchen, everything coated in dust, everything waiting. Boone finally approached, but instead of entering, he paused in the doorway. His gaze swept the room, left, right, back again, almost like he was clearing it. Only after several seconds did he step inside. Ethan noticed. So did Hank. Smart dog. He usually is. Usually? Sometimes he's smarter than me. That earned a laugh. The first real laugh Ethan had heard in weeks. For the next hour, Hank showed him around. The hand pump still worked. The generator did not. The roof leaked in 3 places. The chimney probably needed repairs. Nothing unexpected. Nothing easy. When Hank finally prepared to leave, darkness had settled across the bluff. The ocean had become a black expanse beyond the windows. "You need anything, drive down to my place," Hank said. "I appreciate it." The old fisherman nodded, then looked directly at Boone. The shepherd had returned to watching the ridge behind the cabin, still staring, still focused. Hank frowned slightly. "Funny." "What?" "Your grandmother's dog used to do the same thing." Ethan looked up. "What dog?" "Old shepherd she had years ago." Hank shrugged. "Used to stand there and watch that bluff for hours." The comment lingered after the truck disappeared down the road. Later, after unpacking only the essentials, Ethan built a small fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth slowly spread through the room. Boone lay beside the hearth. The cabin creaked around them. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not yet, just stillness. He sat in an old chair and stared into the flames. At some point he drifted asleep. The sound woke him instantly. One sharp bark, then another. Ethan was on his feet before his mind fully caught up, heart pounding. Adrenaline flooding his system. Boone stood rigid across the room, facing the fireplace, not the flames, the wall beside it. The shepherd barked again. Deep, focused, intentional, then silence. Ethan grabbed his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Dust floated through the light. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Boone refused to look away. The dog stepped forward, placed one paw against the wall behind the fireplace, and scratched once, slowly, deliberately. Then looked back at Ethan, waiting, as though trying to tell him something. Something hidden inside the cabin had finally started calling out, and Boone had heard it first. Ethan did not open the wall that night. He stood in the dark with the flashlight in one hand, and Boone watching him from beside the fireplace. Waiting like the answer should have been obvious. But the wind was rising outside. The roof was leaking over the kitchen. The old cabin groaned with every gust coming off the Pacific. And Ethan had learned a long time ago not to make decisions at 2 in the morning with his pulse still running hot. "Not tonight," he said. Boone looked at the wall, then back at him. "Don't give me that look." The shepherd gave one quiet huff and lay down beside the hearth. But he did not take his eyes off the boards. By morning, gray light had filled the cabin. Mist pressed against the windows so thick that the ocean vanished behind it. Ethan made coffee on a camp stove and ate 2 slices of bread standing at the kitchen counter. Boone ate from his metal bowl, then immediately returned to the fireplace wall. He sat there, straight-backed, patient, like a sentry holding position. Ethan stared at him over the rim of his coffee cup. "You planning to do this all day?" Boone blinked once. That was his answer. The first week became work. Hard, simple, necessary work. Ethan patched the kitchen window with plastic sheeting. He cleared wet leaves from the roof gutters. He dragged rotten boards off the porch and stacked them near the shed. He found Margaret's old tool chest beneath a canvas tarp in the back room. The handles rusted, but the tools still good. Every task left his hands sore. Every evening he slept badly, but at least the exhaustion felt honest. At night, the cabin changed. The daytime creaks became footsteps. Branches scraped the siding like fingernails. The sea struck the cliffs below with deep, hollow thuds that traveled through the ground. More than once, Ethan woke before dawn, with his hand closed around the heavy flashlight beside his cot. His body knew how to wake silently, how to listen before moving, how to count sounds, wind, water, Boone breathing. No contact, clear. Then he would lie there in the dark, jaw tight, waiting for his heart to slow. Boone always noticed. Sometimes the dog would rise from his blanket and cross the room without a sound, pressing his shoulder against the side of Ethan's cot. Not begging, not whining, just anchoring him. By the second week, the fireplace wall had become impossible to ignore. Boone returned to it every morning. He sniffed along the lower boards, scratched once or twice, sat back, waited. Ethan checked for rodents first. No droppings, no nesting, no smell. He tapped the boards with the handle of a screwdriver. Most of the wall answered with a dull wooden knock, but one section just behind the stone chimney gave back a different sound, thin, hollow. Ethan paused, tapped again. Hollow. Boone's ears lifted. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I heard it." That afternoon, Hank Rollins came by with a crate of firewood and a bag of nails. He found Ethan kneeling beside the hearth, running his fingers along the seams in the old wall. Hank set the crate down. "Looking for ghosts? Dog thinks there's something behind here." Hank glanced at Boone. Boone was sitting 3 feet away, eyes locked on the boards. Hank's smile faded a little. "That dog doesn't look like he guesses much." "No, he doesn't." Hank stepped closer and touched the wall. "Margaret had a cabinet here once, long time ago, narrow thing, always locked." Ethan looked at him. "What was in it?" "No idea. She wasn't the kind of woman you asked twice." Hank said it with respect. That evening, after Hank left, Ethan sat by the fire with a notebook open on his knee. He had started making lists the way he did on deployment: roof, water, fuel, food, repairs, risk. At the bottom of the page, without meaning to, he wrote one word: wall. He stared at it for a long time. Then the first log in the fireplace split with a sharp crack. Ethan moved before thought, off the chair, one knee to the floor, shoulder angled toward cover, flashlight in hand. The motion was clean, automatic. Too clean for a man sitting alone in a cabin. Boone was already standing, not alarmed, just watching him. The fire popped again. Only fire, only wood. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. In the dark behind his eyelids, the desert flashed white. A flare above a road, a shouted warning. The smell of metal after heat. He opened his eyes. Cabin, rain, Boone, no dust, no convoy, no radio. He lowered the flashlight. His hand was shaking just enough to make the beam tremble across the floor. Boone walked to him and gently touched his muzzle to Ethan's wrist. Ethan sat back against the chair. "I'm here," he whispered. Boone stayed until the shaking stopped. The next morning, Ethan made the decision. He took a pry bar from Margaret's tool chest, a hammer and a small handsaw. He moved the firewood away from the hearth and pulled back the faded rug. Boone stood beside him, tail low, body alert. "All right," Ethan said. "Let's see what your nose found." The first board resisted. The second split near the nail. The third came loose with a dry groan that sent dust spilling into the air. Behind the wall was not insulation, not brick, not rot. It was a narrow cavity built between the fireplace stones and the outer wall. Too straight to be accidental, too clean to be damage. Ethan aimed the flashlight inside. The beam caught on something dark, metal. Boone stepped forward and sniffed once. Then he sat, very still. Ethan reached into the opening and brushed away 30 years of dust with his sleeve. His fingers closed around a cold steel handle. Whatever had been hidden behind that wall had been waiting there a long time, and now it was coming out. The steel handle was colder than Ethan expected. He tightened his grip and slowly pulled. Dust drifted from the opening. Something scraped against old wood. For a moment it refused to move. Then it slid free, a metal lockbox, dark gray, heavy, about the size of a small suitcase. Boone immediately stood, his ears pointed forward. His eyes followed the box all the way to the floor. Ethan set it down carefully beside the fireplace. The lock had rusted years ago. A faded strip of masking tape remained attached to the lid. Only a few letters were still visible. Margaret, his grandmother. The room suddenly felt smaller. The fire crackled softly behind him. Outside, waves struck the cliffs below. Boone sat beside the box and waited, as though he already knew this moment mattered. Ethan grabbed a screwdriver from the tool chest and worked it beneath the corroded latch. The metal resisted, then snapped. The sound echoed through the cabin. For several seconds he simply stared. 30 years, maybe more. Whatever sat inside had survived storms, winters, salt air, and decades of silence. Finally, he lifted the lid. The smell came first. Paper, leather, old cedar, the scent of something preserved, something protected. Inside were journals, dozens of them. Leather-bound notebooks stacked with extraordinary care. Below them sat folded maps wrapped in oilcloth. Bundles of photographs tied with twine, waterproof document tubes. And at the very top lay a small envelope. Ethan picked it up. The handwriting stopped him cold. He knew it instantly. Margaret Calloway. He had not seen those letters in 25 years. His throat tightened. The envelope wasn't addressed to anyone. Only 2 words appeared across the front. For family. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper. The ink remained surprisingly clear. If you're reading this, then either curiosity finally won, or the ocean finally gave me away. Ethan smiled despite himself. That sounded exactly like her. He kept reading. People always thought I spent my life tending a lighthouse. That was true. But it wasn't all I did. There are things along this coast worth remembering, and things worth protecting. If someone finds this, I hope they're the kind of person who pays attention. The world has enough people who look without seeing. Ethan lowered the page. The fire popped behind him. Boone remained motionless, watching, waiting. Ethan reached for the first journal. Its cover was worn smooth by decades of use. The pages inside were filled edge to edge with Margaret's handwriting. Dates, coordinates, sketches, observations. He turned another page, then another, and slowly realized what he was looking at. This wasn't a diary. It wasn't a personal journal. It was a record. A lifetime of records, ocean temperatures, migration patterns, whale sightings, tide movements, storm activity, rock erosion, sea cave locations. Entire sections were devoted to changes in the coastline over decades. Some entries contained hand-drawn maps. Others held photographs carefully glued to the pages. Every detail had been documented. Every season, every year. For nearly 50 years. Ethan stared in disbelief. His grandmother had barely graduated high school. At least that's what everyone always said. Family stories described her as a stubborn woman who preferred solitude to company. A lighthouse keeper, nothing more. But the evidence sitting in front of him told a different story. Margaret had spent half a century studying the coast. Methodically, patiently, obsessively, and nobody had known or cared. The realization bothered him more than he expected. How many times had he heard relatives dismiss her? How many Thanksgiving dinners had included jokes about her crazy notebooks? How many people had reduced an entire life to a few careless sentences? The thought lingered, because Ethan knew something about being misunderstood, about carrying things nobody else could see. He continued reading. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside, daylight faded, then disappeared. The fire burned low. Boone eventually curled beside the hearth, but refused to leave the room. At some point, Ethan opened a journal dated 1987. A folded photograph slipped from between the pages. He picked it up. The image showed Margaret standing beside a rocky cliff overlooking the ocean. A younger German shepherd sat beside her, alert, focused, watching the horizon. Ethan laughed softly. "So that's why Hank recognized you." Boone lifted his head. The old shepherd in the photograph looked remarkably similar. Same posture, same eyes, same quiet intelligence. For a moment the decades seemed to collapse. Margaret, her dog, the cabin, now, Ethan, and Boone, different generation. Same coastline, same mystery. Near midnight, Ethan opened the final journal stored in the box, the newest one. The last one Margaret had written before her death. Its pages felt heavier somehow, more deliberate. Near the end, several entries focused on a specific location. One place appeared repeatedly, red cliffs. The name surfaced again and again. Certain pages contained sketches, measurements, tide charts, directions. Margaret had underlined it several times, almost urgently. Then Ethan reached the final page. The handwriting there looked shakier, older. The words stretched unevenly across the paper, as though written quickly, or with limited time. He leaned closer. Boone rose to his feet. The dog stepped beside him and stared at the page. The final sentence sat alone, separated from everything else, written in darker ink, almost like a message, almost like instructions. Ethan read it twice before the meaning fully settled in. If Boone found this place, follow the red cliffs. The cabin suddenly felt very quiet. The ocean thundered below. The fire crackled. But inside the room, silence settled around both man and dog. Ethan slowly looked down at Boone. Boone looked back, not confused, not curious, just calm, as though he'd already completed the first part of a mission nobody else understood. And somehow, Margaret had known a dog like Boone would one day be standing here, waiting for Ethan to catch up. The next morning, Ethan spread 3 journals across the kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The Pacific disappeared behind a curtain of gray fog. Boone lay near the stove, watching him. Every few minutes, the shepherd lifted his head whenever Ethan turned another page. The entries about the red cliffs were everywhere, not grouped together, scattered, hidden among years of observations. Margaret had written about tides, seabirds, storms, and then suddenly a note about the cliffs. Then nothing for 20 pages, then another reference, then another. It felt intentional, like she had never wanted the location to be obvious. Ethan copied every mention into a notebook, coordinates, sketches, distances, landmarks. Years ago, during reconnaissance missions, he had learned to assemble information from fragments. A photograph here, a radio call there, a footprint, a shadow, a pattern. Margaret had left a pattern. By noon, he was standing outside with a backpack, compass, flashlight, water bottle, and a folded copy of one of her maps. Boone was already waiting by the truck. Tail still, eyes alert, ready. The trail began behind the cabin, if it could still be called a trail. Decades of wind and rain had nearly erased it. Branches crowded the path. Roots crossed the ground like twisted cables. The forest smelled of wet earth and salt. Ethan moved slowly, not because he was old, because old habits refused to die. He watched the terrain, checked footing, marked landmarks, noticed game trails, potential shelter, exit routes. The same part of his mind that once evaluated roads outside Fallujah now evaluated cliffs on the Oregon coast. Different landscape, same instinct. Boone ranged ahead 20 or 30 feet, never farther. Every so often he stopped and looked back to make sure Ethan was following. Around mid-afternoon they reached a ridge. The ocean exploded into view below them. Massive waves hammered black rocks far beneath the cliffs. Sea spray rose hundreds of feet into the air. For a moment Ethan simply stood there. The beauty felt almost unreal. Margaret had stood here. Sarah would have loved this view. The thought arrived quietly. It hurt less than it used to. Not because he missed her less, because he was finally carrying the memory instead of fighting it. Boone suddenly froze. His ears shot forward. Every muscle in his body tightened. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" The shepherd stared toward a narrow section of trail ahead. Then he growled. Low, barely audible. Ethan stepped carefully forward. The path curved around a rocky outcrop. Beyond it, the ground narrowed dramatically. One side rose into steep stone. The other dropped straight toward the ocean. The cliff edge looked unstable. Fresh cracks spiderwebbed through the dirt. Recent erosion. Margaret's journal had mentioned unstable sections after heavy rain. Ethan backed up, studied the slope, calculated weight distribution, angles, distance, the same way he once studied damaged roads before moving vehicles across them. "We go slow." Boone remained tense. The shepherd moved ahead first, testing each step. Ethan followed. one careful foot at a time. The wind strengthened. The ocean roared below. Halfway across, Boone stopped. His head snapped toward the cliff wall. Then everything happened at once. The shepherd lunged backward, hard. His shoulder slammed into Ethan's legs. The force knocked Ethan off balance. He crashed onto one knee. A deafening crack exploded above them. Rock shattered. A massive slab broke free from the cliff face. It crashed into the exact spot where Ethan had been standing less than a second earlier. Stone fragments erupted across the trail. Dust filled the air. The ground shook. For several terrifying seconds, the world became noise. Wind, rock, ocean, then silence. Ethan coughed and pushed himself upright. His heart hammered against his ribs. Boone stood between him and the fallen debris. The shepherd was limping. Blood stained the fur along his right shoulder. A jagged stone fragment had struck him during the collapse. Boone. The dog immediately looked back, still alert, still scanning for danger, still protecting. Ethan knelt beside him. The cut wasn't deep, but it was ugly. Blood mixed with rainwater and dripped onto the rocks. Boone leaned into Ethan's hand, just briefly, then turned back toward the trail, watching, working, even injured. Something tightened in Ethan's chest, not fear. Not exactly. Gratitude. The kind too large for words. He wrapped the wound with a field bandage from his pack. Years of carrying emergency gear had finally proven useful again. When he finished, Boone nudged his hand once, ready to continue. "You stubborn old fool." Boone's ears twitched. They moved forward carefully. Around the collapsed section, past another ridge. Then the forest suddenly ended. Ahead stood the red cliffs. Margaret's sketches had not done them justice. The cliffs rose from the coastline like rust-colored walls. Deep crimson streaks cut through black stone. The entire formation glowed against the gray sky. Ethan stared, then noticed something else. A narrow opening hidden near the base of the cliffs, almost invisible from above. A shadow within the stone, not marked on any modern map he had seen. Boone was already staring at it. The shepherd took 3 slow steps forward, then stopped. The wind howled around them. Far below, waves crashed against hidden rocks. And somewhere inside the cliffs, beyond that dark opening, another secret was waiting. One even Margaret had spent decades protecting. The entrance sat halfway between the crashing surf below and the towering red stone above. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a shadow. Up close, it became something else. A doorway, ancient, silent, hidden from almost every angle except one. Ethan stood at the edge of the narrow trail and studied it. The opening wasn't marked in any map he'd found inside the journals. At least not directly. Margaret had never drawn it, never named it. She had only left clues pointing toward it that bothered him. People hid things for reasons. The best reconnaissance reports always paid attention to what wasn't said. Boone moved first. The shepherd's injured shoulder slowed him slightly, but his focus never wavered. His nose lifted, testing the wind. Then he stepped toward the entrance. Ethan followed. The air changed immediately. The ocean wind weakened. The temperature dropped. Sound became strange. The roar of the Pacific echoed through stone tunnels and returned from unexpected directions. The flashlight beam cut through darkness. Wet rock shimmered ahead. Water dripped from the ceiling, slow, steady, like a clock that had been ticking for centuries. Boone paused every few yards, listening, smelling, checking. The same methodical behavior Ethan had seen during security sweeps years ago. The old soldier found himself doing exactly the same thing. Corners, blind spots, possible exits, unstable rock. Everything became instinct. The tunnel curved left, then widened, and suddenly the darkness opened. Ethan stopped. His breath caught. The cave wasn't a cave. Not really. It was an entire hidden world. A vast chamber stretched before him. Sunlight entered through cracks high above the cliffs, creating columns of gold that reached the stone floor below. Pools of seawater reflected those beams like mirrors. Color exploded everywhere. Bright green seagrass, purple starfish, orange anemones, schools of tiny fish darting through crystal clear water. Creatures moved beneath the surface that Ethan couldn't name. The place felt untouched, protected, alive. Boone walked slowly between the tide pools. For once, even he seemed curious. Ethan knelt beside the nearest pool. His flashlight wasn't needed anymore. The water was so clear he could see every detail. Tiny shrimp, shellfish, delicate marine plants, an entire ecosystem hidden inside the cliffs. His mind immediately returned to Margaret's journals. Every sketch, every note, every measurement. Suddenly they made sense. This was what she'd been documenting. This place. For 50 years. A movement near one pool caught his attention. He pulled out a journal page from his backpack, then looked back at the water. The sketch matched perfectly, every detail. Margaret had drawn the exact creature decades earlier. The realization sent a chill through him. She hadn't been guessing. She had known this place intimately, as though she'd spent years protecting it. Hours passed. Neither Ethan nor Boone noticed. The cave seemed disconnected from time, disconnected from the world. Eventually, Ethan found a flat section of stone overlooking the largest pool. There he discovered something unexpected. Carved initials, old initials, not Margaret's. The markings had been weathered by decades of moisture, but they were still visible. JSBW and several others. Ethan frowned. Someone else had been here, long ago. Not recently, but not ancient either. The discovery changed something. Until now, the cave felt forgotten. Now it felt abandoned. Those weren't the same thing. He moved deeper into the chamber. The flashlight swept across a wall covered with mineral stains, then stopped. Scratches. Dozens of them. Parallel lines etched into the stone. Not natural, human-made. Ethan crouched lower. The marks looked deliberate. Measurements, height indicators, survey marks. Someone had mapped portions of the cave before. Margaret wasn't the only person who knew about it. The thought lingered and grew heavier. When they finally began the hike back toward the cabin, the afternoon light was fading. The ocean had turned silver beneath gathering clouds. Boone walked beside him instead of ahead. His shoulder was bothering him again. Ethan noticed the slight hitch in his gait. Almost home. Boone glanced up briefly, then kept walking. Halfway back, Ethan stopped at an overlook and pulled one of Margaret's photographs from his pocket. The image showed the same cave chamber, same pools, same sunlight, taken nearly 40 years earlier. He compared it to what he'd seen. Nothing had changed. Almost nothing. Then he noticed something strange. In the background of the photograph stood a man, only partially visible, just a shoulder, part of a hat. Someone Margaret hadn't mentioned. Someone standing beside her, watching. The photograph had been taken intentionally, yet she never identified him. Ethan stared at the image. A familiar feeling settled into his chest. Not fear, not exactly suspicion. The kind that had kept him alive overseas. The kind that appeared when details refused to fit together. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness had arrived. The ocean below was invisible. Only the sound remained. Boone limped toward the porch. Ethan unlocked the door, then froze. The old soldier's instincts fired before logic could catch up. Something was wrong, very wrong. The front porch looked untouched. The lock wasn't damaged. Nothing appeared missing. Yet he knew, the same way he once knew when a street felt wrong, or a checkpoint felt too quiet. He slowly scanned the ground. The beam from his flashlight moved across wet soil, then stopped. A footprint, fresh, not his, not Hank's. Someone had been standing beside the cabin, recently, watching. And judging by the direction of the tracks, they had been looking directly at the front window. Ethan crouched slowly. The flashlight beam hovered over the print. Rain had softened the edges, but not enough to erase it. Boot, adult, recent, no tread pattern he recognized. Not Hank's, not his. The print sat only a few feet from the porch. close enough for someone to peer through the cabin window, close enough to watch. Boone's hackles rose immediately. A low growl vibrated deep in the shepherd's chest. Not fear, warning. Ethan followed the track across the damp ground. There were only 3 visible prints before the rocky terrain swallowed them. Whoever had been here knew enough not to leave an obvious trail. That bothered him even more. The wind pushed against the trees. Branches swayed overhead. The bluff suddenly felt less isolated, less peaceful. Someone else knew about this place, or had discovered it recently. And now they knew Ethan was here. That night he barely slept. The journals remained spread across the kitchen table. Maps, photographs, Margaret's notes. Every detail seemed more important now. Boone stayed awake as well. Several times Ethan woke to find the shepherd sitting beside the window. Watching the darkness, listening. The old instincts returned. Without realizing it, Ethan began creating routines, checking locks, recording unusual sounds, walking the perimeter each morning. Not because he was frightened, because he had learned long ago that complacency invited problems. The next week changed everything. A marine science professor from Oregon State University arrived after Hank quietly mentioned the journals to someone in town. Her name was Dr. Leah Morgan. She spent 6 hours at the cabin reviewing Margaret's records. At first she seemed politely interested, then fascinated, then stunned. By sunset she was sitting silently at the kitchen table, turning pages with both hands. "Ethan." Her voice was almost a whisper. "What exactly did your grandmother do? She kept records." "No." Leah looked up. She documented 50 years of coastal environmental changes. She tapped one of the journals. "This kind of data barely exists." Another page. "These species observations are extraordinary." Another. "The cave alone." She stopped, thinking, calculating, then looked directly at him. "People are going to want to see this." Ethan wasn't sure whether that sounded like good news. Within 2 weeks, more people came. Researchers, graduate students, local reporters, photographers. The quiet bluff grew busier. Articles appeared online. One small newspaper published a story titled, "Forgotten Lighthouse Keeper: Leaves Behind Decades of Coastal Research." The story spread faster than anyone expected. Soon visitors were calling, emailing, requesting interviews. For the first time in years, Ethan felt useful, needed. The strange thing was that none of it belonged to him. It belonged to Margaret. He was simply protecting it. Yet the attention brought something else. The feeling of being watched never disappeared. In fact, it grew stronger. One morning he found fresh tire tracks near the road. Another evening he noticed a distant flashlight moving through the trees. Twice he discovered the gate standing open after he distinctly remembered closing it. The incidents seemed small, individually meaningless. Together they formed a pattern, and Ethan trusted patterns. One afternoon Boone suddenly stopped midway through their walk. The shepherd stared toward the tree line, rigid, focused, the same posture he had used near the cave. Ethan scanned the forest. Nothing, then movement. A flash of dark clothing. Gone instantly. Too fast for certainty, too deliberate to ignore. By then, Ethan had already installed 2 trail cameras near the cabin. Old habits again. Observation, documentation, preparation. The cameras quietly watched while life continued. Days passed. Rain came and went. The ocean remained restless. Then one night, everything happened at once. The storm arrived shortly after midnight. Wind slammed against the cabin. Rain hammered the roof. The Pacific roared beyond the cliffs. Ethan woke to Boone's bark. Not the warning bark he used for wildlife. Not the bark he'd used at the fireplace wall. This one was different. Urgent, explosive. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and moved instantly. The dog was already charging toward the back door. Another bark, then another. Something crashed outside. Ethan reached the window. A figure, running fast, dark clothing, hood pulled low. The person sprinted toward the trees. Boone hit the door before Ethan could stop him. The old latch burst open. The shepherd disappeared into the storm. Boone! Lightning flashed across the bluff. For a second, Ethan saw both figures, the intruder and Boone, closing the distance. Then darkness swallowed them. The chase lasted less than 30 seconds. A sharp yelp cut through the storm. Everything inside Ethan went cold. He ran, ignoring rain, ignoring mud, ignoring the pain in his knees. By the time he reached Boone, the intruder was gone. Only the forest remained. And Boone, lying beside a fallen log, breathing hard, his rear leg twisted awkwardly beneath him. Blood mixed with rainwater along the fur near his paw. The shepherd immediately tried to stand, failed, then tried again, still focused on protecting, still trying to work even injured. Easy. Ethan dropped to his knees. His hands shook, not from fear, from something deeper, something he hadn't felt since Iraq. The sight of a loyal partner, hurt because of something done while standing beside you. Boone finally relaxed when Ethan placed both hands against his shoulders. The dog leaned forward, resting his head briefly against Ethan's chest, trusting him completely. The drive to the emergency veterinary clinic felt endless. Rain streaked across the windshield. The road blurred. Boone lay across the back seat, silent. Every few minutes, Ethan checked the rearview mirror, just to make sure he was still breathing. The veterinarian finally emerged 2 hours later. He's going to be okay. The words hit harder than Ethan expected. His knees nearly gave out. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, tears filled his eyes. Not because he was weak, not because he was broken, because Boone had followed him into every dark chapter of his life. And tonight had almost cost him that. The next afternoon, Ethan returned to the cabin alone. Boone remained at the clinic for observation. The silence felt wrong. The cabin felt empty. Then he remembered the trail cameras. He sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the footage. Hour after hour, nothing. Wind, rain, trees. And then shortly before midnight, one frame appeared. A face illuminated by lightning. Just long enough. Just clear enough. Ethan froze. Because he recognized the man immediately. And the realization was far worse than a stranger. Ethan stared at the frozen image on the laptop screen. Lightning had illuminated the man's face for less than a second. Less than a second was enough. Ryan, his son. The room felt strangely still. Outside, rainwater dripped from the roof. The ocean rolled against the cliffs. Somewhere down the road, a gull cried into the evening wind. But inside the cabin, Ethan heard only his own breathing. Not because he was shocked, because part of him wasn't. The signs had been there, the questions, the timing, the sudden interest in the property, the way Ryan had laughed when he handed over the cabin. At least Grandma's old beach shack is still yours. The words came back now with a different meaning. Ryan had known something, maybe not everything, but something. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For a moment he saw another face, Sarah, standing in their kitchen years ago, laughing while Ryan carried Boone as a puppy, a little boy trying to hold a dog that was already too big. The memory hurt more than the betrayal, because the boy in that memory would never have done this. The next morning, Boone came home. His rear leg was bandaged, his movements slower, but his eyes were bright. The moment Ethan opened the truck door, the shepherd pushed forward and rested his head against Ethan's chest. Neither of them moved for several seconds. "You scared me, partner." Boone's tail thumped once, just once, enough. Back at the cabin, the dog limped through every room as if conducting an inspection, checking, verifying, making sure everything remained secure. When he finally settled near the fireplace, Ethan noticed how carefully Boone lowered himself onto the floor. Age, injury, years. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Nothing lasted forever, not dogs, not fathers, not sons. 3 days later, Ryan arrived. No warning, no phone call, no text. A black SUV rolled up the gravel road shortly after noon. Ethan saw it from the porch. Boone saw it first. The shepherd rose immediately. His injured leg barely mattered. He moved to Ethan's side and stood there, watching. The SUV stopped. The driver's door opened. Ryan stepped out. For a moment, neither man spoke. The ocean wind pushed against their jackets. Gray clouds drifted overhead. Ryan looked older than Ethan remembered. Not years older, worn older. His expensive confidence seemed thinner now, more fragile, Dad. Ethan didn't answer. Ryan glanced at Boone. The shepherd's eyes never left him. Can we talk? Ethan folded his arms. You're here. Ryan looked toward the cabin, toward the cliffs, toward the ocean. Anywhere except directly at his father. Finally he said, I know how this looks. Ethan almost laughed. You were sneaking around my property at midnight. Ryan winced. Okay, fair. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The silence stretched. Ryan finally sighed. I saw the articles. The university articles. The news articles. Ethan nodded. Of course. By now, Margaret's journals had begun attracting attention well beyond the local community. Researchers visited weekly. The cave remained confidential, but interest in Margaret's work was growing fast. Ryan looked toward the horizon. People are talking about grants. Ethan said nothing. Conservation funding. Still nothing. Potential land value. There it was. The real reason. Boone shifted slightly, positioning himself between Ryan and Ethan. Not aggressively, not threatening, simply refusing to move, Ryan noticed. His expression tightened. He still doesn't like me. He likes people who tell the truth. The words landed harder than Ethan intended. Ryan looked away. The ocean thundered below. Finally, he spoke again. I didn't come here for money. No. Ethan studied him carefully. Years of reading people had taught him that lies often appeared in tiny places. Eyes, shoulders, timing. Ryan wasn't lying. At least not entirely. That made things more complicated. I came because I owe you an apology. Ethan looked out toward the sea. The sentence should have felt satisfying. It didn't. It felt late. Ryan swallowed. The company's sale went bad. Ethan remained silent. The investors pulled out. Another pause. The market turned. Another. We lost almost everything. Now pieces began fitting together, Ryan continued. The house is leveraged. Ethan slowly turned back toward him. The house? Ryan nodded. The one I took from you. The honesty surprised him. For once, Ryan wasn't hiding behind legal language, or explanations, or excuses, just facts. The way soldiers reported casualties. Direct, uncomfortable, real. I made mistakes. The wind carried the words away. Ethan looked at his son. Really looked. The expensive confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was a tired man standing on a bluff, trying to figure out how he had become someone he barely recognized. Then Ryan said something unexpected. I knew about the journals. Everything inside Ethan stopped. What? Ryan lowered his eyes. I knew Grandma kept records. The world narrowed, just slightly. How long? Years. Boone stood up. The shepherd's ears rose. Ryan continued before Ethan could speak. Grandpa told me when I was a kid. The air seemed colder suddenly. He said there were notebooks. What else did he tell you? Ryan hesitated. Too long, then answered. He said there was something valuable hidden along this coast. Ethan stared at him, not speaking, not moving, waiting, the same way he had waited during interrogations overseas. Patience often revealed more than pressure. Eventually Ryan looked up. His voice was barely above a whisper. I thought the cabin was worthless. He paused. Until I didn't. Boone never took his eyes off him. And for the first time since arriving, Ryan seemed unable to meet the gaze of either his father or the dog. Because deep down, he already knew. The real judgment waiting on that bluff wasn't coming from Ethan. It was coming from the choices he had made long before he ever drove there. And Ethan had finally realized something. This story wasn't just about greed. It was about a secret that had been buried in his family for generations. A secret older than Ryan, older than the company, older than him. And the deeper he dug into Margaret's past, the more certain he became that someone had spent decades making sure the truth stayed hidden. Ryan left before sunset, not because Ethan told him to, because neither of them had anything useful left to say. The black SUV disappeared down the gravel road, leaving only dust and silence behind. Boone watched until the vehicle vanished completely. Then the shepherd limped back toward the porch. Ethan followed. The evening sky above the Pacific glowed orange and gold. Waves rolled endlessly toward shore. For a few minutes, neither man nor dog moved, just listening, just breathing. The conversation with Ryan had opened something Ethan couldn't easily close. A question. Why had Margaret hidden her work? And who had spent years discouraging anyone from looking too closely? The answer began arriving 2 weeks later, one page at a time. The university team had started digitizing the journals. Dr. Leah Morgan visited almost daily now. Graduate students came and went. Researchers cataloged photographs and maps. The cabin felt less like a forgotten home and more like a working archive. One rainy afternoon, Leah entered carrying a cardboard document box. "You need to see this." Ethan looked up from repairing a chair. The expression on her face told him everything. She had found something important. The box contained old correspondence, letters, dozens of them, some unopened, some returned, some never mailed. Margaret's handwriting covered nearly every envelope. Ethan carefully lifted the first one, addressed to a marine biology department in Seattle. Another, a conservation office in Oregon. Another, a federal coastal research program. And another and another. Every letter contained observations from the coastline. Data, species records, maps, warnings. Requests for scientific review. Most had never received responses. Some had been returned unopened. Others had never left the county. Ethan frowned. How? Leah handed him a second stack. These weren't Margaret's letters. These were local records. Property documents. Town council notes. Land surveys. One name appeared repeatedly. Walter Calloway. Ethan's grandfather. Ryan's grandfather. Margaret's husband. The room suddenly felt colder. Had always been described as practical, respected, successful, a businessman. The kind of man people admired. But the documents painted a different picture. Walter had repeatedly blocked attempts to classify portions of the coastline for environmental protection, including the area surrounding the Red Cliffs, including the cave, including several sites Margaret had documented extensively. Ethan sat slowly, reading, turning pages, reading again. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Margaret spent decades trying to share her discoveries. Walter spent decades preventing anyone from taking them seriously. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, through influence, connections, money, small decisions made behind closed doors. The kind of actions nobody notices until years later. Ethan stared at one particular letter. Margaret had written it in 1987. The handwriting was unusually emotional. If this information disappears, the coast will disappear with it. Someone had scribbled a note across the top. Not interested. The handwriting belonged to Walter. For several seconds, Ethan couldn't speak. Boone rested his head on Ethan's knee. The old shepherd seemed to sense the shift in the room, the weight of it, the sadness. The realization that some betrayals didn't begin with Ryan. They began generations earlier. Ryan hadn't created the pattern. He inherited it. That didn't excuse anything. But it explained more than Ethan wanted to admit. That evening, he sat alone on the bluff overlooking the ocean. The wind moved through the grass. Boone lay beside him. The shepherd's injured leg stretched awkwardly forward, healing, slowly, like everything else. Ethan thought about his grandfather, then his father, then himself, 3 generations, each carrying pieces of the same story. Walter hid the truth. His father ignored it. Ethan never looked closely enough to see it. And Ryan had nearly repeated the entire cycle. The realization settled heavily into his chest. The ocean below crashed against the cliffs. Wave after wave, year after year, patient, relentless, the same way truth eventually wore through stone. Several days later, Ryan returned. This time he arrived in an old pickup truck, not the SUV, not the expensive image, just Ryan. He found Ethan repairing storm damage near the cliff path. Boone immediately noticed him. The shepherd rose, stepped forward, then stopped. No growl, no bark, just observation. Ryan looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, work gloves hanging from his back pocket. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. I read Grandma's letters. Ethan continued working. I didn't know. Still no response. I knew there were journals. Ryan swallowed. I didn't know Grandpa buried everything. The hammer stopped. Ethan looked up. Ryan wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't defending himself. For once, he simply looked ashamed. The ocean wind moved between them, cold, steady, honest. Then Ryan asked quietly, "What happens now?" Ethan looked toward the cliffs, toward the cave, toward the coastline Margaret had spent 50 years protecting. Then toward Boone. The old shepherd was watching both men carefully, waiting, almost as if he understood the answer mattered. Ethan thought about everything Ryan had taken. The house, the company, the trust, the years. He thought about the night Boone nearly died protecting him. He thought about Margaret writing letters nobody read. And he thought about something soldiers learn after enough years. Trust is never given, it's earned. Finally, Ethan spoke. If you want forgiveness, Ryan stood completely still. If you want any place in what's being built here. The wind carried his words toward the sea. You earn it. Ryan nodded once, slowly, as though he already knew what was coming. And Ethan had finally decided exactly what that would look like. Ryan showed up the following Saturday before sunrise. No black SUV, no polished shoes, no lawyer's folder tucked under his arm. Just an old pickup, a thermos of coffee, and a pair of work gloves that looked as if they had been bought the night before. Ethan was already outside, so was Boone. The shepherd stood near the porch steps, weight shifted off his injured leg, watching the truck roll slowly through the mist. The air smelled of wet grass, salt, and wood smoke. The ocean was still hidden in the dark below the bluff, but its voice carried up through the trees. Ryan climbed out and shut the truck door quietly. For a moment, he looked like a man arriving at the wrong funeral. Ethan said nothing. Ryan lifted the gloves slightly. I brought my own. Good, that was all. The first job was clearing the old trail to the red cliffs, not the safe portion, the bad stretch, the place where rain had eaten through the slope and blackberry thorns had swallowed the path. Dr. Leah Morgan's team needed safer access if the tide pool surveys were going to continue. Hank Rollins came by with a chainsaw and 2 thermoses of coffee. 3 graduate students arrived in mud boots. A young volunteer from town carried survey flags. Ryan took a pair of loppers and waited for instructions. Nobody treated him like Ethan's son. Nobody treated him like an owner. Nobody treated him like someone important. They treated him like labor, which was exactly what Ethan intended. By mid-morning, Ryan's jacket was torn at the sleeve. Mud covered his boots. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. He cut brush until his hands blistered. When one of the students asked him to carry a bundle of old branches up the hill, he did it without comment. Ethan watched from the upper trail, not closely, not obviously, but he watched. Old habits. Observed behavior under pressure. Words were cheap. Fatigue told the truth. Boone watched too. The shepherd remained near Ethan most of the morning, lowering himself carefully whenever the leg bothered him. But each time Ryan came too close, Boone's head lifted, eyes steady, no growl, no bark, just memory. At noon, they ate sandwiches on flat rocks overlooking the water. Ryan sat apart from the group at first. Then Hank waved him over with half a sandwich. Don't sit there like a punished schoolboy. Eat before the gulls steal it. Ryan moved closer. Nobody said much. The ocean filled the silence. That became the rhythm of the following weeks. Every Saturday at 6, Ryan arrived, rain or cold, wind or fog. He carried tools, hauled rope, cleared steps, pulled rusted wire from the old fence line, scraped barnacles from the lower cliff stairs at low tide, while waves slapped the rocks beside him. He did not complain, at least not where Ethan could hear. Sometimes Ethan caught him standing alone, staring at the cave entrance from the ridge. Not greedy now, not calculating, just trying to understand how much had been hidden in front of him. The work changed the cabin too, slowly. A new roof went on with grant money from the university. The porch was reinforced. The old shed became a storage room for field equipment. Margaret's journals were moved into archival boxes. Researchers began calling the place the Callaway Coastal Station, though Ethan still thought of it as Grandma's cabin. Boone had a bed beside the fireplace, and another on the porch. People learned to step around him with respect. He became part of the station without anyone declaring it. The dog who found the wall, the dog who found the path, the dog who kept watch. But Boone was aging. Ethan saw it in the small things. The hesitation before jumping into the truck. The extra time it took to stand. The way the injured leg stiffened in cold weather. At night when the wind pushed hard against the cabin, Boone still tried to rise and inspect the room. Sometimes Ethan would place a hand on his shoulder. Stay. Boone would look at him, unhappy with the order, but obey. One evening in late winter, Ethan woke to a sharp crack of thunder. His body reacted before the storm registered. He was out of bed, back against the wall, flashlight raised, breathing hard. The cabin flashed white with lightning. For half a second, the room became another place. Another night, another blast of light over a desert road. Then Boone limped across the floor, slowly, painfully. He pressed his head into Ethan's thigh, not with urgency, with patience. Ethan lowered the flashlight. His fingers found the old dog's ears. Rain hammered the roof. The thunder rolled away. Clear, Ethan whispered. Boone stayed until he meant it. By spring, the trail was safer. The lower steps had been repaired. University teams completed the first official survey of the hidden cave. 2 species Margaret documented in the 1970s were found again in small numbers. The discovery made the papers. This time Ryan was there when the article arrived. He stood on the porch while Leah read it aloud. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated loudly. They simply listened. The way people listen when someone long ignored has finally been heard. Ryan looked down at the ground, then at Ethan. I wish she could have seen this. Ethan folded the newspaper carefully. Maybe she did. Ryan didn't answer. The next morning, a weather alert came over the radio. At first it sounded ordinary. Heavy rain expected, coastal winds, possible flooding. By afternoon, the forecast changed. A deep Pacific system was strengthening offshore. By evening, the county issued warnings. Storm surge, landslide risk, evacuation notices for low-lying coastal roads. Hank arrived at the cabin just before dark, rain running off the brim of his hat. There's a big one coming. Ethan looked toward the ocean. The water had already changed color. Dark steel, angry, restless. Boone stood beside him on the porch, ears pointed into the wind. The old shepherd's nose lifted. He sniffed once, then twice. His body went still, the same way it had at the fireplace wall, the same way it had at the Red Cliffs. Ethan felt the shift immediately. This wasn't just weather. Something was coming. And Boone knew it before the rest of them did. By midnight, the storm had a voice. It moved over the Pacific like something alive, dragging wind and rain across the coastline, until the cabin shook on its old foundation. The windows trembled. The stovepipe rattled. Far below, waves struck the cliffs with a force Ethan could feel through the floorboards. The county radio kept breaking in with alerts. Coastal flooding, road closures, possible landslides. Mandatory evacuation for homes near the lower harbor. Ethan stood over Margaret's maps spread across the kitchen table, while Leah, Hank, and Ryan leaned in beside him. A lantern swung gently from a beam overhead, throwing shadows across 50 years of handwritten warnings. Margaret had marked 3 danger zones in red pencil. One of them sat directly above a narrow coastal road where 8 houses still stood. Leah tapped the page. This slope is going to fail. Ethan looked from the map to the rain-dark window. How long? Could be hours. Could be less. Boone stood at the door, ears forward, body rigid. His injured leg trembled beneath him, but he refused to lie down. Ryan noticed. Dad? Ethan was already moving. They called the sheriff's office, then the fire station then. Every neighbor Hank knew by name. The old fisherman took the radio. Ryan took the truck keys. Leah grabbed the map case and stuffed Margaret's pages into waterproof sleeves. Outside, the world had turned sideways. Rain flew in hard sheets. Trees bent low over the road. Headlights barely cut through the storm. Ethan drove the first truck. Ryan followed in Hank's. Boone rode in the passenger seat, braced against the dashboard, eyes fixed on the windshield. At the lower road, they found people already confused and frightened, standing in porches with flashlights, asking if it was really that serious. Then the hillside groaned, not loud at first, low, deep, like the earth clearing its throat. Ethan didn't argue after that. He moved from house to house with clipped calm, the same voice he had once used in convoys when hesitation cost lives. Move now, take medication, leave the rest. Roads closing. Ryan carried an elderly woman through ankle-deep water. Hank guided 2 children into the back of his pickup. Leah kept checking Margaret's map beneath a plastic cover, rain streaming off her sleeves. 15 minutes after the last porch light went dark, the slope gave way. Mud, trees, and rock poured across the road with a roar that swallowed the ocean. The houses remained standing. The road did not. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Boone barked, sharp, once. Ethan turned. The shepherd was staring toward the north trail, the red cliffs. No, Ethan said quietly. Boone barked again. Then he limped forward. Ryan looked into the rain. What is it? Ethan listened. At first only wind. Then faintly beneath the storm a sound reached them. A whistle. Human. 3 short blasts. A distress signal. Ethan grabbed the flashlight. Tourists. Leah's face went pale. There was a group at the overlook this afternoon. Boone was already moving. Not fast, not young, but certain. Ethan followed with Ryan close behind. Hank stayed with the evacuees and called rescue on the radio. The trail to the cliffs was almost gone. Rain turned dirt to grease. Branches snapped in the wind. Twice Ryan slipped and caught himself against the rocks. Ethan moved low and steady, one hand on the slope, the other gripping the flashlight. Boone stayed ahead. Every few yards he stopped, checked the air, then chose the path. Once a tree cracked overhead. Ethan shouted, "Down!" Ryan hit the ground beside him as branches crashed across the trail. Boone didn't retreat. He stood in the rain beyond the fallen limbs, waiting for them. At the cliff overlook, they found the first backpack, then a broken walking pole, then the voices. 3 people huddled on a narrow ledge below the trail, trapped where part of the path had collapsed. A man, a woman, and a teenage girl, soaked and shaking, clinging to the rock. Ethan dropped to his stomach and aimed the flashlight down. "Don't move." Ryan tied the rescue rope around a cedar trunk, with hands that shook but held the knot. Ethan checked it once, then again. Old habit, trust but verify. Boone lay beside the edge, whining low, eyes locked on the girl below. The rescue took 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Ryan lowered the rope. Ethan guided from above. Leah arrived with 2 volunteers from the rescue team just as the first tourist was pulled up. The teenage girl came last. Halfway up, her foot slipped. She screamed. Boone lunged forward so hard Ethan grabbed his collar to keep him from going over the edge. "Stay." The command cut through the storm. Boone froze, every muscle in him fighting the order. The girl reached the top. Ryan pulled her into safety. Ethan rolled onto his back in the mud, rain hitting his face, chest heaving, Boone collapsed beside him. Not dramatically, just folded slowly onto his good side. His work was done. Morning came gray and quiet. The storm moved inland before dawn. The coastline looked wounded but standing. The lower road was destroyed, but every family had made it out. The tourists survived. The cave remained sealed and safe, and Margaret's red pencil marks had saved lives. By summer, the cabin became the Callaway Coastal Research and Rescue Center. A new sign stood near the gate. Because someone cared enough to keep watching. Students came. Fishermen came. Children from nearby schools came to see Margaret's journals behind glass and hear the story of the dog who found them. Ryan stayed, not as owner, not as son trying to reclaim anything, as a volunteer. He cleared trails, repaired steps, carried equipment, and showed up before sunrise without being asked. Ethan did not call it forgiveness, not yet, but sometimes they drank coffee on the porch without needing words. A year later, Boone no longer walked the cliff trail. His muzzle had gone almost white. His injured leg stiffened badly in the cold. Most days he lay on the porch where he could see the ocean, the gate, and the door all at once. Still watching. Always watching. One evening, Ethan sat beside him as the sun lowered over the Pacific. Inside the center, Margaret's photograph hung above the journals. Outside, waves moved gold beneath the fading light. Boone rested his head on Ethan's boot. Ethan placed one hand in the old shepherd's fur. He thought of the house he lost, the company, the life erased by signatures and greed. Then he looked at the cabin, the students laughing near the shed, Ryan stacking gear by the trail, and the sea Margaret had protected long before anyone believed her. Nothing he lost had brought him here. Boone had. The dog had heard what everyone else missed, and because of him, Ethan Callaway had finally found the one place in the world where being left behind had led him home. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you believe loyalty can change a life, leave a simple 1 in the comments. And if you've ever had a dog, a friend, or someone who stood by you when everything else fell apart, leave a 0 and tell us their name. We read every comment, and your stories are often just as powerful as the ones we share here. If Ethan and Boone's journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more unforgettable stories waiting for you. Stories of courage, second chances, loyal dogs, and people who refuse to give up when life knocks them down. Click on the next story on your screen, and I'll see you there.